In this video, we're going to have a look at FL keys in a bit more detail. I use it for a lot of demonstrating of melodies in a lot of these videos, so it's worth having a look at FL keys to see exactly what the controls do and how you can use it a little bit more and experiment with it to create some better sounds. It is a very basic plugin that comes with FL Studio, and most of the time you'll find that you won't actually change the controls that come with it, but it's worth looking at nevertheless. Let's open it up by going up to the channel rack, clicking on the plus button and scrolling down to FL keys. You'll get this window here. It comes with 4 main presets, which are called wavetables. You can just click on this bar here and choose piano, grand piano, Rhodes or roto organ. And you can see that as I click on these controls down here change as well. So what do these controls do? The decay dial allows you to change the decay time. If you set it all the way to the left, the notes played will change into a sustained note, which means you can hold them down for as long as you wish, like so. If we turn this all the way over to the right, we'll start changing the decay time, and if I move it all the way over here, you get this effect instead. The note will gradually decay to 0. The release dial allows us to change the release. So if I've got the decay set to 100% and I increase the release all the way to 100%, I can press this note once, release it, and the note will continue playing. Whereas if I change the release all the way down to minus 100%, I'll get this effect instead. And it will get released immediately. The pan dial allows me to change this either to the left speaker or to the right speaker. The stereo dial allows me to affect the stereo width. It doesn't allow you to put the sound entirely into mono, but you can change whether this is set to the normal stereo amount or whether it's a larger amount instead. Next we have the overdrive dial. This is the sound when it's at normal, and if I change this all the way over to the right, it sounds like this. So a much more distorted sound. Useful for 80s music. The treble dial allows me to affect the higher frequencies. If I change this all the way to the left, I have this sound, with the overdrive set to 0. And with the treble dial changed to the right, I get this sound. So I get a much brighter sound. The LPD dial allows me to change the LFO rate. Remember that LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. And this won't have an audible effect, but it can be very useful nonetheless. The stretch dial allows you to change the amount of stretch, and it's particularly useful for higher pitch notes. Next, the velocity. The velocity to muffle dial allows you to change again whether this will sound brighter or a little bit more faint. The muffle is essentially a form of dampening, so it dampens the sound. Velocity to hardness makes the sound seem a lot harder. The hardness changes the virtual size and brightness of the piano. Finally, the sensitivity. This adjusts how sensitive the volume of FL keys is to when you change velocities in the piano roll. If you set this to its minimum, it will completely ignore any velocity changes at all. The tuning setting changes the pitch. That was me playing the same note but just changing the tuning dial. And the detune detunes the note. FL Keys is a great synthesizer to begin with and is very useful for prototyping and using for writing very quick melodies. But if you want something that's more extensive and more realistic as a piano sound, I suggest looking at other third-party plugins, some of which I will mention in my course. At the 3X OSC synthesizer. Just a quick reminder on what a synthesizer is. A synthesizer is any sound generating plugin. The 3X OSC is pretty much the simplest synthesizer you will find in FL Studio, or indeed in any digital audio workstation or any other form of music production software. It consists of 3 oscillators, hence its name. An oscillator is a sound wave producing function of a synthesizer. Let's have a look at the 3X OSC now. To create it, we can go up to the channel rack, press the plus button, and scroll down to 3X OSC. Or, of course, you can add this using the Add submenu in the top left-hand corner. Let's take a look now at the interface of the 3X OSC. On the left-hand side, you can see 3 numbers which represent each oscillator: oscillator 1, oscillator 2, and oscillator 3. The icons next to each oscillator give you an idea of the current sound wave that is currently selected. So in this case, you can see that what's called a sine wave is currently selected for all 3 oscillators. We could change this though to, for instance, a square wave, a sawtooth wave, or anything else that we would want. Over to the right of this are 2 sliders, the phase offset and the detune. The phase offset simply determines the point at which the sound wave begins. So you can see here that generally a sound wave begins at this point, but if I move this slider, that determines the point at which the sound wave will start, and it would move gradually along this particular wave. The detune detunes this from its original pitch. So if I was playing a C note, it would then detune it from the C note. The best way of doing this is to give you an example. So I'll play you a C note first of all. And now let's just detune that using these sliders here. Whether you put these up or down depends on whether you're detuning it up or down the octave. Moving on from this, you can then see a knob called the coarse pitch. This determines the pitch at which your current sound wave is being produced. So you can see currently here that it's set at 0. For oscillator 2, it's set at 12 semitones down, which is an octave. And on oscillator 3, it's set at 24 semitones down. This means it's 24 notes down from the original oscillator. So again, the best way of demonstrating this is to give you an example. If we set all of these back to their default positions, reset the detunes, and play this, you can hear 1 note. But if I then adjust these all up by 5 semitones and play the same note, it'll sound like I'm playing a different note completely. Using these in combination with each other will give you a much more complex and varied sound from the original. Let's take a look at some of the other controls now as well. To the right of all of these coarse controls here on each oscillator, we have something called the fine pitch, which essentially just allows you to more finely control what you're adjusting to the pitch with this control. So for instance, if I pitch this up by 2 semitones and then move this, you're then finely pitching the sound even more, up to 100 cents, which is then the equivalent of a whole extra semitone. So this gives you the control of going from plus 100 to minus 100. To the right of this is the panning option. This allows you to pan an option so that it's only coming out of one speaker. So for instance, we could pan oscillator 1, oscillator 2, and oscillator 3 to only come out of the left speaker by moving this all the way to the left, which you will now hear if I now press the note down again. And similarly, if we move this all the way over to the right and play it again, it only comes out of the right speaker. Finally, on oscillator 2 and oscillator 3, we have a mix level. This determines how loudly your two oscillators will get played. There isn't the control for this for oscillator 1 because by default, if you're playing the 3XOSC, you need to have at least one oscillator producing some sort of noise for it to be producing sound at all. So you can only adjust the volume levels of oscillator 2 and oscillator 3. These are called the mix levels. So for instance, oscillator 2 is currently set here at 50% and oscillator 3 is set at 25%. You also have a control here for the amplitude modulation of oscillator 3. And if you tick this and also change the stereo phase randomness of oscillator 3, you can further modulate the sound by randomizing its phase, similar to what this button does. However, this is not an option you will probably find yourself using very much. The Flex plugin. The Flex plugin is a brilliant synthesizer to use as a beginner, and I would strongly encourage you to open it up and experiment with it as much as possible. Let's take a look at launching it now and have a look at the interface. As always, we go into the channel rack, we click the plus button, and we scroll down to where we find our plugin, which in this case is the Flex plugin. We click on it to launch it, and you will get this window which comes up. Now, let's just first of all go over what a synthesizer is, and then I'll explain why Flex is different to other synthesizers. So a synthesizer is a sound generating device. It will generate sound waves. You then define what those sound waves are, for instance, whether it's a sine wave, square wave, or whatever it is, and you then use the controls and parameters on that synthesizer to further sculpt and manipulate that sound into exactly the type of thing that you're after. So with most synthesizers, you'll get a whole array of very advanced controls, filters, effects, and so forth, and they can be quite daunting to use as a beginner. With the Flex plugin, it's a little bit different. The Flex plugin is much more centered around presets, which are preset sound designs which have been made by the developers of the plugin. And Flex gives you a limited amount of control over the sound of those particular presets. So you can do things like, for instance, add a delay or a reverb, which you can see at the bottom here. And we also have a couple of filters as well. But other than that, there is not anything else you can do to actually alter the original source sound itself. So if you don't like the sound of a particular preset, you can't change it, it's just better to pick another one. You do, however, have what are called macros in the Flex synthesizer, which is a feature unique to Flex. These macros appear in this top right hand corner here, and the controls that they'll have, which are listed at the top of each slider, so you can see in this case with the plugin, with the preset that I've got selected, I've got a filter control, vibrato control, unison, character, reverb and delay control. These will not necessarily be the same for every preset. For instance, if I just start clicking around, you'll see that although some of them are the same, some of them are a little bit different. You can see these change as I click through. So Flex is what's called a read-only synthesizer. So it's very good for being able to experiment and play around with sounds that have been pre-made already, but you won't be able to make any more advanced changes to the source sound yourself. It is better to use other synthesizers to do this. That is simply not possible to do in Flex. So, let's take a look now in detail at the interface that we've got here. On the left hand side, on the far left, you've got what are called installed packs. With Flex, packs are a whole selection of presets that have been designed by the developers. So for instance, the first one that I've got selected is called Arcson Cityscape. These presets are sort of centered around a Batman sort of theme. So you'll find that all of the presets in here would be very useful for creating a soundtrack to an action movie, for instance. If you click on these different packs, you then get all of the different presets that are associated to that pack. So with Arcs and Cityscape, I've got 66 presets in here. If I click on Essential Pianos, I've only got 8. But these 8 presets are a little bit more customizable than the ones in some of the other packs. You can see, as I click down these packs, all of the different types of presets, and each pack has also got a little thumbnail at the bottom here as well. You've also got an All button here, which will give you every single preset of all of the packs that you have currently got installed. So you can see that with all of the packs I've currently got, comes to 792 presets. You can also add more packs to the Flex synthesizer. At the time of recording this video, FL Studio's developers, ImageLine, are constantly adding more packs to Flex, and you can see these under the Online Packs button down here. If you scroll down, you can see that there are currently, at the time of recording this, up to 8 more packs that you can potentially download. And in FL Studio, if you've got the news ticker turned on in the top right hand corner, you'll always get alerts about when they're releasing new packs. Let's now take a look at the rest of the interface of Flex. First of all, this box here, the visualizer. By clicking on these 4 different buttons at the top, it allows you to visually see the sound that you're creating in different ways. So for instance, if I just pick a sound here and start playing it back and clicking on these different buttons, you'll see how we can see it visually in different ways. So what do all of these do? Well, first of all, this one, the first one, just gives you what's called an oscilloscope. So this is basically what the sound wave looks like. You can see that this particular sound is quite basic. The second one is what's called a spectrum view. This allows you to see all the frequencies of the sound. The third one is a vectorscope. What a vectorscope shows you is the stereo image of a particular sound. So what that means is whether the sound is in mono and being played in both speakers in the centre of the mix, or whether it's being played in stereo and being played differently in your left and right speaker. If I play back this sound, you can see just a single line appears in the centre. That means that this is a mono sound. If, however, I clicked and scrolled down to a different preset, and I play this back, you'll see that a different image comes up, which represents a stereo image instead. Finally, we've got this last icon here. And if I play back this sound again, you get what's called a spectrogram, which shows you all of the frequencies of this particular sound, and is something that you would see in a parametric EQ as well. A parametric EQ is a form of equalization that allows you to visually see what you're changing in a sound. Let's now take a look at the macros part of the interface. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the macros part of the interface is the part where you get a little bit more control over your sound, and the controls will change depending on the preset you've got selected. This means that the options you've got to change will also change. So I'll try and go over some of the options that come up regularly, but obviously these will be dependent on the preset you've got selected. First of all, I've got here a narrow slider for this particular sound. This affects the stereo width of the image, so we can put it either in mono or stereo by changing this slider up or down. The tone basically changes how bright the sound seems. So if you want a slightly dull or more faded sound, you can move this slider up in order to distort it a bit more. Darken does a mixture of this and also compress the sound as well. And squash is simply another term for compression. This completely just compresses the sound entirely. The echo is a delay effect, whilst the space is a reverb effect. We also have a flanger and a phaser. We have here a pitch control. This controls the pitch of the source sound, and you can change this from up to 0 to plus 24 semitones, or to -24 semitones. The next panel is the filter, which controls the cutoff, the resonance, and also this third control here, the envelope amount. We can control the envelope of the filter using these 5 controls here. We have our attack, decay, sustain and release controls, but we also have an additional control here called the hold, which is something that you find in some envelopes in some synthesizers. We also have the same controls for the volume envelope. Down here we have a master filter control, and you can change this to be either a low pass filter, high pass filter or band pass filter, and there are several other types of filters you can select too. In addition to the other panels, we have a delay and reverb effect. Finally, we have a limiter effect as well. The Flex plugin is particularly useful for beginners, and I would highly encourage you to experiment with the Flex plugin before looking at other synthesizers in FL Studio.